This morning, our honoree is Vivian Falkenflik, who I met many years ago at Julia and Ken Lupton Reinhardt's home. And it's delighted me to have Vivian as a participant in our Psalm classes. Vivian is another literature person, but her who taught at UCI, and Vivian's key interest, which already begins with her undergraduate studies, was not only literature, but history and art and lots of other areas in which different worlds come together, and had the privilege for many, many years of being one of the key shepherds of the UCI core curriculum, which brings together professors from different areas, largely a freshman class, but not just, to give an introduction to humanities. So she taught, for instance, with Julia Lupton, who is not with us this morning, but often is, a class on the Ten Commandments, a class on Shakespeare. She's done some teaching in that context on civil rights. She's also drawing on her graduate focus in French literature, a translator of everything from novels in French to a book on surrealism. And I delight, Vivian, as I see you on the screen, that you're a regular part of the class. Not unlike yesterday, your awareness of one word and it being somewhat out of place adds to our conversation. So again, today we're dedicating our study to Vivian. I do look to have a day to dedicate for each of you a psalm. Do let me know if there's a particular day that would be of significance to you, and I will try and see if we can't so mark it. With that, we now begin, again, honoring Vivian, but honoring each of us who share in learning. Psalm 84. Psalm 84 is a journey psalm, and it really has a sense of movement. It's a psalm of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, written by somebody apparently on pilgrimage. At the same time, it's not a psalm that's a normal part of our liturgy, and yet is a very important part in terms of individual verses in our liturgy. So Psalm 145 is traditionally recited twice in the morning and once in the afternoon, the Ashrei. It's called the Ashrei, but it's Psalm 145, and the introductory line is from this psalm, from Psalm 84. Ashrei Adam, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Od Yalucha Sela. Happy are they who dwell in your house, they will ever praise you. So what we call Ashrei is actually Psalm 145, but using Psalm 84:5 as the introduction. Another verse that is very familiar is the closing verse, in which we say, Adonai of hosts, happy is the mortal who trusts in you. That's said every evening as the second line of Ma'ariv, the evening prayers. It's also in our Havdalah paragraph. Last, in terms of famous lines, people say, as a common expression, may you go from strength to strength. That line is also in this psalm and appears nowhere else in Hebrew scripture. So here's an example of 3 verses from this psalm that have great resonance in liturgy and folk expression, where the psalm itself is not so well known because it as a whole is not part of our liturgy. It is used because it's a psalm of yearning for the temple that is used in Jewish tradition, even more so in the Catholic and Protestant traditions, as the psalm of dedication of a church or an altar. because of, again, the longing here that you'll hear in a moment for being in the temple. It's interesting that the psalm does not yearn for sacrifices. It doesn't explicitly describe a destroyed temple, as some of the psalms do, and a yearning for the rebuilding, though this psalm will be read by medieval commentators as, like Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, he'll read this as a psalm of yearning. David Kimchi in France, 12th, 13th century, as the yearning of the exile for redemption, saying that if you continue to hope for the temple, then you will be restored. His commentary to the closing verse. Last, that same Radak, along with others, will say that this psalm is actually very early, that it's King David in exile when he's in hiding along the coast among the Philistines, writing a psalm yearning for prayer, for closeness to God's altar. So to pull all this together, this is a psalm of Korach. We finished yesterday with Asaph psalms, of which there were 12. There are 11 Korach psalms. We saw some already. 42 to 49 are psalms of Korach. This is the first one after this hiatus. It'll be true for next week. We'll read 2 more Korach psalms and 1 the following week. With that, Psalm 84, which again, entitling it, I look for a verse that seems to be a core goal of the psalm. In this case, it's about the dwelling of God. Therefore entitled, Happy are they who dwell in your house. For the conductor, upon the Gittit, by the sons of Korach, a psalm. Ma yididot mishkanotecha, how beloved are your dwellings. Adonai tzvaot, Adonai of hosts, longing and even languishing is my spirit for the courtyards of Adonai. My heart and my flesh sing joyfully to the living Ale. Even a bird has found a house, and a swallow a nest for itself, where she can place her young. Near your altars, Adonai of hosts, my royal and my God. Ashrei yoshvei veitecha od yahalucha sela. Happy are they who dwell in your house. They will ever praise you. Selah. Happy is the mortal whose refuge is in you. Roads in their heart, passing through the valley of Bacha, they make it into a spring. Even blessings enwrap the guide. They go from strength to strength, appearing to God in Zion. Adonai Elohim, Tzvaot, Adonai, God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, God of Jacob, Selah. See our shield, God. Look upon the face of your anointed, for better is a day in your courtyard than 1,000. I would choose the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in tents of wickedness. For sun and shield is Adonai God. Grace and glory Adonai gives, never withholding good from those who walk with integrity. Adonai of hosts, happy is the mortal who trusts in you. All right, so now to take it apart from the beginning. Again, when we get to selahs, that is the Masoretic understanding as well of a division. So that verses 1 to 5 is, and then there's a selah. Then you'll see after 9, there's a selah. And then no more selahs. Nachum Sarna, the great Bible scholar who taught at Brandeis, says he surmises that Selah might be from the word sal, a basket, that it may be kind of a drum sound to mark an ending. Not clear. That's something I haven't seen elsewhere, but it's possible. So we don't know exactly what a gitit is, beginning with verse 1. It's also used to be a wine press, and Rashi says it's therefore suggesting the quality of exile or the emotion of this as a psalm of longing, as if you're being pressed by oppression. Clearly, verse 2 and 3 defines the trajectory ahead. How beloved are your dwellings, Adonai of hosts. And again, it's in the plural, mishkenotecha, which allows for lots of different kinds of commentary. Why it's in the plural can be because there are many rooms to the sanctuary or different temples. Not so clear. And verse 3, longing, even languishing, is my spirit for the courtyards of Adonai, my heart and my flesh sing joyfully to the living. You can see in verse 3 the whole person, spirit, heart, flesh, suggesting the fullness of the person, both physically, in terms of flesh, spirit, the breath of life, heart, understood in the Bible as not only the heart as we see it, but the mind. The whole person is yearning, and it's built up. Nichsefa, v'gam kalta. And the word kalta is to be consumed, or Ibn Ezra will understand it, the Spanish early commentator, as I am about to expire. Such is the nature of my longing. And I chose to use the word languishing, which means a heart that's getting weaker because of longing. And yet it flips. And this psalm, again, verse 3 being an encapsulation of the theme, is longing and celebrating. My heart and my flesh sing joyfully to the living El. And here too we have this word El as the last two psalms toward the beginning, kind of a generic God. Though here we do already have Yud-He Vav-He in verse 2. But here there's a sense of the yearning for God with joy and singing to God. The word Yiranenu, Rina, is one word of many words in Hebrew for joy, but this particular word suggests singing, the singing of joy. And that might lead in, meaning singing, to the image of a bird. Verse 4, even a bird which again is transient by its nature, has found a house. So I don't have a house. I'm at a distance from the temple. As I mentioned, some see this as King David, and others would see it as an exile, longing for the house, God's house, where she, the bird, places her young, the swallow, a nest for itself. You can even see to this day that the kotel will have kind of brush between the cracks. And the rabbis, the commentators, will debate if the house, or if you will, that this bird's nest is in the ruins of the temple, or it's simply a suggestion that for those outside walls, birds do nest. Swallow, Richard Levy will say, is the most common bird in Israel. And it's a bird that's not migratory and puts its nest in places of habitation. Here, there's this added line, near your altars, as if it's the birds who can even find a house near your altars, but not me. And then back to praising God, Adonai of hosts, my royal and my God. Something that I learned in reading commentaries that I never noticed regarding birds and being near the altar. In the time of the temple itself, birds were kept away from the temple by a scarecrow. This is the part I never noticed before. It's mentioned in two places in the Talmud, Menachot 107a and Arichin 6a, that they put a scarecrow on the roof of the temple to keep the birds away because they didn't want to have the birds, dropping their drops on the holy shrine. So as a sacred space. And so there's a certain tension for some in reading this image of the birds. And now that famous line, happy are they who dwell in your house, they will ever praise you. So again, there's this seesaw here between longing and anticipation of rejoicing when one gets to the temple. And this verse 5 ends the first unit, which can again be anticipation. That's of longing and looking forward to being in God's presence by being in the temple. Mind you, there is in this psalm no reference to sacrifices or to the cult. At the same time, what's interesting is the word used is chatzarecha, which is courtyards. And it's pointed out that the courtyard, like in verse 3, I long and even languish my spirit for the courtyards. The courtyards is where the public went, not necessarily where the priests went. That would be heichalecha, the temple. So this is the yearning of the pilgrim for the courtyards of the temple. And this quality of happy is the mortal, ashrei ha'adam. And the word ashrei ends this first unit and will appear as the first word in verse 6. So first word in 5 and 6 is happy. And it'll also be in the last verse. In that sense, it's that reoccurring motif, an inclusio. The other word that's somewhat an inclusio that's rare is Adonai Tzvaot, the God of hosts, which gets repeated 4 times. But back to the flow. Again, I'm stuck on verse 5 because it's one of the verses that we all know who pray regularly. Ashrei yoshvei veitecha, od yahalucha selah. And to know its context, which is a psalm of yearning for God's presence. It's really yearning for God's presence even more. The house is where you encounter God, but as we'll see, it's yearning for God's presence. And now, movement. The pilgrimage begins, verse 6. Happy is the mortal whose refuge is in you, roads in the heart. And again, it's a little elliptical. What is roads in the heart? It can mean that I have imprinted in my heart how I'm going to get to the temple. Sforno, in particular, he is a later commentator, Sforno, living in Italy. He will see a lot of this. He lives in Italy 1475 to 1550, dying in Bologna. He'll spiritualize this. So we'll see it throughout. He'll see these as metaphors, as roads being literally God's direction, God's enlightenment, God's way is in my heart, as what gives me the motivation to begin this journey. Others deal with it more concretely, and they'll say, Misilot is not any road, it's like the main road. So some will translate it as byways, some will translate it as highways. I've even seen highways crisscrossing in my heart. And now the journey continues. Verse 7, passing through the valley of Bacha, they make it into a spring. Even blessings enwrap the guide. And here, ambiguity. He's moving. We don't know what the valley of Bacha is. Literally, Bacha might be understood as the valley of tears, like that HBO series at the moment on the 73 war. The phrase valley of tears will stick, but it's not clear, in fact, what it means. Richard Levy will say that Bacha is balsam, and that in the desert or on the way there are balsam trees, and that the pilgrims would dig around those trees and find water. So therefore they make it into a spring. This last phrase, even blessings enwrap the guide, is my chosen translation, which is kind of literal, but I will add the word moreh, here guide, can also be understood as in Joel, the prophet 2:22, verse 23, as early rain. And so here's another translation. Indeed, the early rain cloaks or engulfs it with blessing, which would be a description of when he is on pilgrimage during the early rains, which would be Sukkot, 3 pilgrimage holidays. Some see this as a Sukkot pilgrimage because of that. But moreh can be guide, it can be teacher, it can be, as in the Septuagint, the early Greek translation, lawgiver, referencing either God or literally you're on the road and your guide, because you're the pilgrim, is enwrapped in blessing. I chose to see these verses, 6, 7, 8, and into 9, as a description of the walking. And therefore there is in this case, a chosen small g guide who leads the way enwrapped in blessing that you're following. And as you're going, it's arduous to do these journeys largely by foot in the biblical time. And that famous line, verse 8, they go from strength to strength, appearing to God in Zion. So as you walk, you're finding that your enthusiasm allows your strength to grow so that you are able to find the stamina in order to reach. Isaiah 40:31, just a related image. They that wait for Adonai shall renew their strength. And so the goal is to appear to God in Zion. You want to be seen by God as the pilgrim. And then it's going to flip for God seeing you. But here, you're coming for God to see you rather than God doing. And then it'll flip to seeing God. Adonai, verse 9, God of hosts, hear my prayer. Now you're in the temple. Hear my prayer. Give ear, God of Jacob, Selah. You've arrived. See, now a prayer. Here comes the prayer to God. See our shield, God. Look upon the face of your anointed. Again, a little bit obscure. What's it mean to see? Who is this shield? Here's a variety of possibilities. Targum, those Aramaic translators, say shield as the merit of our ancestors. It's like the beginning of the Amidah, Magen Avot. So see our shield, protect us. God, we know we have hubris coming before you, but the merit of our ancestors, let it protect us. Many of the classic commentators, Radak and Sforno, will understand the shield as another name of God. See our God, shield, God, God, look upon the face of your anointed. Some see the shield as a human king. So look up, and the comment will be that once you arrive, and we've seen this in other Psalms, you then have a national consciousness. And so, God, look upon our king, human king, look upon the face of your anointed. That's another name for human king. Or this can be a prayer for the Messiah. See our shield, look upon the face of your anointed. Verse 11. For better is a day in your courtyard than 1,000. Better for us to be able to be in your presence than 1,000 other days of exile. I'll add, in a Christian lens, Augustine of Hippo, that early Christian commentator on the Bible, will think of the 1,000, better is a day in your courtyard. That's in reference to the world to come for Augustine. Better is a day in the world to come than 1,000 in this world of the living. But for the rabbis, it's better is a day in the temple than 1,000 in exile, mostly, as a commentary. I would choose even, I'm putting in the word even, the threshold of the house of my God, meaning not even to be there, but just to be close to it, than dwell in tents of wickedness. So you can have greater comfort than being on the threshold. But I'd rather, if those are tents of wickedness, be even here close to the temple than at a distance. And now verse 12. For sun and shield is Adonai, God, grace and glory. Adonai gives, never withholding good from those who walk with integrity. Interestingly, in the Bible, sun is never used as a word to describe God. Probably because in the ancient world there was a lot of people, both in Egypt, Canaan, who worshipped the sun. This is a distinctive, even referring to linking God with sun. And it's understood by the commentators in a whole variety of ways. So again, those who are concrete, may my journey. Now some are looking at this as the farewell. May my trip home, if you will, when I leave the temple, be one of sunshine, all the more if you thought of this as the early rain season above, and shield me. Either shield me from getting sunburnt or protect me on the way, because you are the God of chen, kindness, and kavod, glory. And glory, again, is often also used as what we take or hold within us of God's presence. Adonai gives. God is a giver who does not withhold good from those who walk with integrity. And again, it's a walking psalm, and therefore it brings us to this closing line. Adonai of hosts, happy is the mortal who trusts in you. And that's the inclusios. Adonai Tzvaot, that gets repeated 4 times. And the image of Ashrei, and Adam, a mortal. I had a teacher who was on sabbatical from Israel named Dov Rappel. My classmate, David Wolpe, used to refer to him as the Wizard of Oz. He was this little man who seemed to know everything. He was truly inspirational. I once spent a Shabbat with him in Israel on a kibbutz that he helped create, which is the kibbutz of Yavne. And I was delighted to see a commentary by Benjamin Siegel quoting Dov Rabbi. He was a professor at Bar Ilan in Bible and other things, Dov Rappel, who says, to pull this together, that he sees this psalm, for some of its distinctive elements, as written by a soldier stationed at a distance from the temple. And here's why. The word Adonai Tzvaot, all the more as a direct address, is rare in Scripture. Here it occurs 4 times. And Tzvaot means armies, the God of hosts, the God, that's the military name for God. the reference to the shield, and the tents, which he says can be understood as the tents of wickedness in verse 11, are the tents of the enemy. Better for me to be in God's house than living even peacefully among those who are wicked, my enemy. And so I'm delighted to hear Dov Rappel quoted, Professor Rappel, as the possibility that this psalm, with those distinctive elements of Adonai Tzvaot directly addressed, the God of war, and shield and tents, being written by a soldier. So to pull this together and then to gain your comments, Psalm 84 is a psalm of pilgrimage, a psalm in which we feel the longing for God's temple, many different words used for it, Ohalecha, Chatzarecha, the courtyards, the image of Bayit, home, the image of the nest of the bird, and yet not a description of a yearning for sacrifice, interestingly. Rather, mostly the joy anticipated of God's presence, a God who is gracious, who is giving to those who seek God and walk the path of integrity. And so now I look to learn from you some of your comments, again, as we bring to mind Vivian as our honoree for this learning. Any thoughts on Psalm 84?
Yes.
Cantor Shula.
I was struck by two different influences connected to Psalm 84. One influence, these are all theories of mine.
Okay.
These are not in any way things that are out there as facts, but things that sprang to my mind as you were talking.
All right.
The first one is verse 2. I'm thinking that it is possible that that line was borrowed from Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. The Ma and Mishkenotecha seem to be in common as a structure for this line.
So let me pause with only one comment at a time to be able to react to it.
Okay.
Just for me to give context for everybody. Again, one of the things that is the nature of Psalms is the echoing earlier layers of Scripture, that for the listener to whom these Psalms are chanted, once again, Psalms are composed to be spoken out loud to an audience, largely understood as poems said at the temple to pilgrims. So these are often written by priests, like the sons of Korach, we know served in the temple as one point of description in Chronicles. So that first thing to know, it's about assonance, it's about hearing them, and they're often echoing an earlier layer. And what Cantor Shula is pointing to is the words of the pagan prophet Bilam, hired to curse Israel and instead blesses the people in the desert. And his words, which we know from our liturgy as well, is how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, Mishkanotecha, Israel. And so there are in the verse 2 the word Ma and Mishkanotecha, that dwelling place in God, an echo potentially of Bilam. Okay, one more. Keep it focused on just one more, Shula, and then I'll have
one is kind of odd, probably for everyone, but it came to my mind in your lovely introduction to our honoree today, Vivian, who you said has a lot to do with literature.
Yes.
And suddenly I realized, remembering again from far away when I was in 5th grade in Jerusalem in school, that they taught us a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, a poem called El Hatzipor, to the bird, a poem which was totally about longing and yearning. So he used the tzipor, the bird, as a tool to express longing, which very much looks like it could have been borrowed from here. And in verse 3 are particularly two words that are prominent in that poem, where it says kalta nafshi, which is exactly what he says in the first verse of his poem, nafshi chalata. So I am here to tell you my theory that Chaim Nachman Bialik, even though he may not have been a religious guy, I'm not sure, he was influenced by the beautiful poetry of Tehillim to write one of his famous poems.
So I thank you for that, Shula. I'm just putting up the thing here because I want to show one thing that you brought to my mind. And that is, I love what you just did by the first question Shula asked was resonance from the past embedded in the poem. And now, as you can see with the Chaim Bialik poem, Israel's laureate poet, is that words or parts of Psalms get echoed into modern poetry as well. This keeps rippling forward. I put this up because I also want to show you verse 4. There's a Masoretic anomaly, and that is in the middle of verse 4, there's a big kuf. For the word is Cain, which means nest. The Udror Cain, the swallow's nest. And the question is why did the Masoretes, which are as long as 1,000 years after the poem, 500 years, we don't know when the poem is written, make it large? No one really knows, but the letter Kuf can be 100 in Gematria. And one commentator, Ibn Bachya Pekude, will say that the temple, the roof was 100 cubits high. And this is playing on both nest, but the yearning for the temple that had a high roof of 100 cubits. So wherever there's an anomaly, there's room for speculation. What you shared, Shula, is less speculative. Clearly, because the word kalata is rare in this context, let alone nafshi kalata, and the image of birds. One last comment about birds, but birds are identified with song, which again is my flesh sings joyfully to the living ale. That's verse 3. And then the birds are singing. So the singing of birds can be understood as an image of longing and joy. That dual quality in this poem of longing, anticipating God's presence, which equals joy, enduring joy. Let me take one more comment. Ahuva, do you have anything to add today?
I do.
Go ahead, Ahuva Ho, and then Mimi for the last comment, and we'll pull it together. Go ahead, Ahuva.
I was looking at the structure of verse 4. It looks very strange at first. Verse 3 talks about the longing to the temple. And then suddenly there is something about a bird. So it's really very strange. However, if you skip that, the first part of the first verset, then you go to Et Mizbechotecha. Now he's shifting again his attention to the temple again. So what I'm saying is that the first part of 4 was inserted there, and it divides, it separates what the second part of verse 4 would have been connected and the continuation of verse 3. It is in terms of structure. I don't think that this psalm happened after the destruction of the temple. I think it's way before. because he longs for a place that still existed.
Yeah. So
Uh,
let me react to that on two levels. One, to say I always gain from Ahuva's sensitivity to the choices of language and flow. In this case, what she points out, what I hear you pointing out, Ahuva, is that the first half of 4 seems out of like an insertion, because on some level, verse 3 dealt with longing for the courtyards. That theme gets picked up in 4b, which is the longing to be near God's altars, as if that continues to describe the courtyards. And then, Adonai of hosts. So the question then is, why this imagery of the birds, 2 different kinds of birds? I'll add, it's tzipor, which can either be bird in general, but some translate it as sparrows, in contrast to the second bird, dror, which is usually translated as swallows. So why is this there? It can either be to pick up on the image of singing, because that was the close here. My flesh sings joyfully, libi ufsari yiranenu. So it could be a free association from singing joyfully, yiranenu. Your mind goes to the birds, but it can also be a literary device to build anticipation. So it's a break. He's longing for the courtyards. There's a break that creates tension, and then to the altars. And so why, but it's clearly a literary device. So I thank you for that, Ahuva, and being able to bring to the foreground this unusual imagery of the birds and their nests. Mimi, last comment, and then I'll pull it together.
Yes. The whole psalm, I hear the Ashrei, the happiness and the yearning and the longing. The only word that describes the enemy or the others is at the end of verse 11. Interesting that the word that's used is wickedness.
Yeah. Yeah. In Hebrew, the word resha, I translate as wickedness. Again, Rasha, we know from our Passover Seder, the 4 sons, one of them is the Rasha, often translated as the evil son or the bad son, the one of wrongdoing. We're not sure who dwell in tents of wickedness, if it is, as Rabbi Rappel, Professor Rappel, suggests, if it's enemies, or it's simply people too involved in their earthly pursuits. And in contrast, this psalmist's yearning is for that which transcends the tent. He's yearning for the home of God, to be seen by God, to see God, that is deeply anticipated at the beginning, a longing that is almost as if the heart is dying. It's such an intense yearning, languishing, that then does get fulfilled, where the middle of the psalm, and I'm pulling it together now, has the sense of movement and journey to the temple. It's a question whether the closing are the words of let me stay here, or they're the words of prepare me for my trip home. But what is true is, as Mimi points out, this psalm is not focused on the enemy or the other or even wickedness, other than this passing comment. It's focused on yearning to be in God's presence, which is why this psalm is familiar to us from the Ashrei, the introduction to another psalm, 145, that we recite in prayer, in community, as a taste of what would have been a time of the temple. As Ahuva pointed out, we're not clearly talking about a destroyed temple here. We don't have the direct images of ruins, but the commentators in the Middle Ages who were in exile clearly saw this psalm as describing ruins, which is why the bird nests, which were not allowed to be part of the temple when it stood, are described, because as they read it, this is the ruins of the temple that the birds get to make homes in. I yearn for it to be rebuilt. And Radak, David Kimchi, again, that commentator from early France, will say, 12th, 13th century, if you yearn for the rebuilding of the temple and do it with joy, it will yet happen. And now, 1,000 years or 900 some years after David Kimchi, we're privileged to live in a time not of a rebuilt temple, but at least of having reclaimed a Jewish homeland. So with that, I again thank each of you for participating in unpacking Psalm 84. Next week, we move into the middle of the 80s. We honored today Vivian. If there are those who have a Kaddish to say, I invite you now to join together to honor loved ones. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shekhamei rabbah
Amen.
v'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayei chon uvyomei chon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei
Shmei
Rabba mevarach
Barach
leolam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekusha b'richu
Richu.
le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran v'yoma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom B'imrumav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen.
Amen.
My gratitude to each of you for sharing today. I wish everybody a world of peace, as contrast to the chaos we have seen. May it be a world of harmony, and may we get a taste of that world of harmony with Shabbat before us. So to all, thank you for being part of our study, and Shabbat Shalom.